Innovation Policy Group, alongside with the Center for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy and the Babbage Policy Forum. So we're a community of people in Cambridge looking at industrial innovation, and what brings us together is our shared interest in industrial innovation, but also the interest in understanding what is the role of government in facilitating the transfer of knowledge between the first I of science and innovation and the second I of industry and industrial growth. We're also all interested in integrating different perspectives, particularly engineering and economics, to address these big questions. So today discussion, we're going to be sharing some of our recent work that we have been developing in collaboration with UK government agencies, but also international organizations. We'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. In the discussion, we'll be answering some of your pre-submitted questions, but feel free to pose additional questions using the Q&A function that you have there in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. We try to answer as many questions as possible. But to kick off today, we're going to have a presentation by my colleague Jennifer Castaneda. She's going to be talking a little bit about the work we've done for BEIS recently. That's just 10 minutes. Then I'll be giving an overview of the work we're doing for the UN Industrial Development Organization, looking at the role of resilience in industrial policy and industrial strategy. And then we're going to have a discussion, open discussions with Clare from BEIS, again, trying to get Clare's impression about this work, but also trying to address some of the questions you'll be posing today. So first of all, Jennifer will take us through the work that we've been doing with BEIS. So thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this seminar. As Carlos mentioned, in this first part of our presentation, I will focus on the work we have produced for the Department for Business, Energy and Industry Strategy in the UK. In particular, I will focus on the policy brief titled How Manufacturing Can Emerge Stronger. In this policy brief, we reviewed policies delivered by governments around the world to protect manufacturing industries, but that at the same time were trying to modernize their industries, strengthen the resilience of their industries in the future, and improve their sustainability. From our international review, we identified 5 key priority areas for fostering future growth of manufacturing industries. The first one is related with policies focused to improve the resilience of manufacturing industries. And this range from mapping the domestic production capabilities, coordination of supply and demand of critical goods, but also business advisory services. And among the most developed countries, we also observe some reshoring initiatives. The second priority area we identified is related with policies focused on improving the sustainability of the industries. And this go from high-level Green New Deals to R&D incentives, but also investments in infrastructure and incentives for households to buy electric vehicles and also energy efficient supplies. Previous crises have taught us the importance of protecting innovative firms. In this area, we have identified R&D incentives and also support for startups, support also for adopting digital technologies, and training for and subsidies for training. As the economic recovery prospects are still uncertain, different governments have also delivered efforts to improve market diversification. This included export advice, finance, and insurance. Finally, there is increasing evidence of how particular firms, how specific firms, regions, and the industries have been disproportionately affected during the pandemic. Governments have responded to these deepening inequalities by targeting particular industries and regions, and also making investments in digital infrastructure and digital skills. Most of these measures, or many of these measures are new, but a common approach was to leveraging existing policy instruments by expanding the funding and also relaxing the eligibility criteria. Now, I will explain in more detail two of the policies that we review. One is a high-level policy, a large-scale policy, the Korean Green New Deal, and the second one is a more targeted one, that is the French automotive sector support plan. The South Korean New Deal is a very ambitious policy initiative. It sets targets for 2022 and 2025, but as the President Moon Jae-in expressed in the presentation of this initiative, the Korean New Deal sets the foundation for a longer vision for the country. It aims to position South Korea as a global leader in digital and green technologies. At the same time that it addresses short-term challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, it also addresses or responds to technology trends and changes in consumer behaviors. Additionally, similar to the US New Deal that was launched by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s, it placed people at the center of the program. It is based in three key pillars: the Digital New Deal, the Green New Deal, and the Stronger Safety Net. In particular, the Green New Deal aims to accelerate the transition towards low carbon and eco-friendly economy. It is not an entirely new policy. It builds on the National Strategy for Green Growth launched in 2009, and it is aligned to a net zero target of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and also a target of 20% of renewable energy as a part of the total of the capacity production of the country also by 2030. It involves an investment of about the equivalent of 40 billion pounds by 2025, both from public and private resources, and it is expected to create over 600,000 jobs. It involves three strategic areas: green transition of infrastructures, low carbon and decentralized energy, and innovation in the green industry. The third strategic area is particularly related to manufacturing, and some projects related with this area include large-scale R&D demonstration projects of renewable energy, also leveraging digital technologies for green industrial complexes, support for startups. They even talk about a green startup town and a green integrated cluster, and support to develop the manufacturing technology and a private public fund to foster green businesses. As I already mentioned, a key characteristic of this Korean New Deal is that it articulates both economic and societal challenges. The third pillar, a stronger safety net, focuses on improving the skills of the people. It aims to protect those more vulnerable during crisis, but also it aims to develop the skills needed for digital and green transformation. It involves an investment of around 17 billion pounds, and it is expected to create over 300,000 jobs. There are two strategic areas in this pillar: the employment and social safety net, and investment in human resources. Key initiatives involved in these areas include expanding the support from employment to self-employment people, helping new employees in the labor market, in particular in IT fields, and also job matching support for SMEs to help them attract talent from science and engineering. They are also, in this area, they are providing training for improving the work environment. And in terms of investment in human resources, they make high emphasis on training digital and green talents. For example, they have a target of training 100,000 individuals in artificial intelligence and software development. In addition, they also consider in this third pillar, big investments in digital infrastructure and equipment. Now I will describe in some detail the French automotive sector support plan. This automotive sector support plan was a response from the French government from the effects that during the pandemic the automotive sector suffered. In fact, the trajectory observed by the French automotive sector was very similar to that observed to the UK automotive sector, with losses of over 80% during the second quarter of 2020. This automotive sector plan involves investments of over 8 billion euros in 3 strategic areas: renew the French fleet for clean vehicles, invest and innovate to produce the vehicles of tomorrow, and support enterprises in difficulties and protect employees. An interesting characteristic of this sector support plan is that this support provided by the government was conditional to the commitment of the industry to reduce CO2 emissions, but also to locate in France high value-added research and production activities. Some initiatives included in this sector support plan are financial incentives for households to buy electric vehicles, public procurement of electric, hybrid, and hydrogen vehicles, investment in electric charging infrastructure, the creation of an automotive future fund that includes both loans and equity capital for modernization, digitalization, and ecological transformation, as well as R&D and innovation grants. Finally, the support plan also includes subsidies for training and apprenticeships in key areas such as digitalization, automation, and sustainability transition. Now I will hand it back to Carlos, who will describe in more detail those policies related with resilience.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Please, if you have any questions about this presentation, note them down in the QA box and I'll try to address them later on. So now I'll share my screen to have the next 10-minute presentation before going and talking to Claire. So yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about the international experiences, especially those looking at resilience. So I will start with a reminder of where we are. And just perhaps to reflect on some of the lessons from previous crises. So you might recall, actually I used a similar slide for a presentation I made 10 years ago. So at that time, the world was still suffering the effects of the financial crisis. Newspapers illustrated the situation with these kind of headlines. Some were more descriptive than others. But at the time, when the financial crisis ensued, there was suddenly this interest on understanding the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, so the importance of the real economy. You might recall prime ministers and presidents talking about rebalancing the economy, and then how manufacturing was back in fashion, and so was industrial strategy. So just for example, just take a moment to look at this statement here done again around 10 years ago by the European Commission, saying in official communication that it would set a target to increase the share of manufacturing in the economy, having realized its importance in the crisis. So if you're wondering, actually, so this was the target to increase from 16% to 20% by 2020. So if you're wondering, no, the target was not achieved, and it in fact seems to have been forgotten. This percentage has remained basically at the same level. And it's interesting to see that in the international narrative, actually some countries have established these targets and understood the importance of of manufacturing in recovering from crisis. Countries like Singapore, like Japan have these kind of targets that have remained over the years. So yeah, with that background, just where we are right now after the pandemic, broadly speaking, manufacturing and trade are back to pre-pandemic levels. The effect among countries varies, as you can see in this graph. You can see, for example, China, how it had the first decline in December of 2019, and then other countries follow. So you see here, UK and Germany follow a similar trajectory. What is interesting is that 1 year on, China and Korea are up by 8.1 and 4.5%. Germany and UK are down still by 2% and -3%, as well as the US. So even though the recovery is globally there, there's still obviously some disparities between the countries, the level of activity in terms of manufacturing in those countries. And obviously that is a positive sign, but there's still many challenges ahead. The world economy is still experiencing a recession. It's expected last year, well, it's estimated that in 2020, the recession was around 3% of global economy, with the pandemic still ongoing. 100 million jobs might be lost permanently, because even though this dip that we see here in the recovery, obviously that had implications for employment in manufacturing industries, as Jennifer mentioned, as the demand collapsed in some sectors like automotive. We also have obviously some calculations about between 90 and 120 million people that will be pushed into extreme poverty. And of course, the threat of climate change and other disaster is ever more present. So even though we're going out of these waves, there are bigger waves as well in our way. And what we would like to discuss today a little bit is about the role of manufacturing in tackling those problems that we're facing. So one key lesson that came out of the crisis, just to remind again ourselves, is that manufacturing plays a critical contribution, or provides a critical contribution to the socioeconomic resilience of nations. Manufacturing is critical to life and national security, critical to tackling emergencies, and critical to economic recovery and growth. Let me just talk a little bit more about these lessons. So in terms of why is it critical to life and national security? So manufacturing goods obviously are critical during normal times. It provides the food that the medical supplies that we use in our hospital and other basic necessities. But also critically, manufacturing is interconnected with critical infrastructure, with critical sectors in the economy, like transportation, electricity, and communication. Manufacturing provides those components, those systems, those engineering services that economies need to actually keep running. So a key question here then is, the incapacitation or destruction of which manufacturing supplies and assets would have a debilitating effect on the sustenance of life and functioning of the economy. So we need, so these are the open questions for policymakers coming out of this work. Second one is critical to tackling emergencies. I mean, obviously it was very evident during this crisis, the strategic importance of these goods to tackle certain types of emergency. In March 2020, the WHO provided this list of COVID-19 critical items that they didn't represent a huge part of manufacturing trade, but obviously they were critical products like PPE, diagnostic equipment, and clinical care equipment. Important thing is that, yes, this time it was this kind of goods, but the crises are gonna keep coming. So this graph shows that the frequency of globally disruptive events is increasing. This is comparing the last 20 years and the 20 years before that. All these things, flooding, storms, earthquakes, are still happening. And the next crisis will not be the same. It will require different types of manufacturing goods. So for example, temporary shelter, insulation, other housing supplies are important in the case of an earthquake, as was learned in 2011 in Japan, for example. Those kind of manufacturing goods become more important. So the question then is the country able to produce and distribute critical items required to tackle disasters? And again, the different types of disaster. So that's part of national thinking as well. So critical to economic recovery and growth, just as we saw that quote from the European Commission, Countries like Korea and Singapore have recognized that manufacturing has offered these pockets of resilience in times of crisis. So for example, this communication from the Ministry of Economy and Finance from Korea saying, you know, what pushed the recovery of Korea that we saw there in that graph is mainly ICT and manufacturing. And again, having the policy question then is, how well do we understand the contribution of manufacturing to recovery and long-term economic growth? We're working then with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization right now to talk about how to strengthen resilience through disaster management. So the Sendai framework, it's a global agreement that seeks to support countries in its implementation and the monitoring of emergency management and disaster management measures. And it encourages countries to use post-disaster reviews as opportunities to enhance learning and public policy. So we went through this crisis, we went through this disaster, how can we build back better? And they defined the build back better in terms of sustainable development and resilience and improved resilience. So development measures, making nations and communities resilient to disasters. And one of the aspects of the framework is these phases of emergency management, that we shouldn't be just thinking about the response past the event, but what can we do to prevent, to be prepared, and to recover after the event as well. So the question that we ask ourselves is, what is the role of manufacturing and industrial strategy in creating these capabilities for prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery? What we've done then is to, first of all, look at how manufacturing is vulnerable to the risks during a disruption, during an emergency. So in prevention is defined as activities and measures to avoid existing a new disaster risk. So what do you do to avoid those disruptions to supply, operations, and demand in manufacturing? So in terms of supply, you can provide incentives to reduce the supply chain vulnerability, incentives and regulation to build strategic inventory supplies. You avoid that need of that problem of getting not having the inputs necessary for the production. And operations, enforcement of regulations to minimize disaster risk. For example, this is quite important in earthquake-prone areas. So just to comply with those regulations to make sure that your strategic production facilities are not affected during an earthquake, for example, flooding, etc. But also, there's been a lot of discussion about these incentives to build sovereign capabilities of critical supplies. So next crisis, next medical emergency, can we produce many of these goods domestically? And demand as well, the strategic stockpiles of critical goods by government. And obviously, how do you prevent being affected by a sharp decline in demand? Many companies, of course, were able to do that because they have these rainy day incentives. So an example of these incentives to reduce vulnerability is the subsidies and the different measures the Japanese government has been implementing to rebuild production capability of critical items like PPE, but other items as well. And the increased emphasis in policies like China Plus One, which is the idea of having, in addition to China, a different base so that it's not overly reliant on a particular country and region. So for example, having another base of the Japanese companies in India and Bangladesh as locations for nearshoring. In terms of preparedness, the knowledge and capacities to effectively anticipate, respond, and recover. So this is about what do you need to understand, what kind of regulations you need to have in place, what kind of capabilities your institutions need to have. And in terms of preparedness, then the mapping of the supply chain risk and vulnerability, so companies actually understand what's going on. And part of that is this business continuity planning. In terms of operations, mapping of domestic manufacturing capabilities, and in terms of demand, mapping those disruptions in demand during crisis. And there's a lot of work being done there by WHO and others to try to understand how demand fluctuates in types of crisis and how the producers can respond to that. There is also a lot of emphasis on the supply chain task forces to coordinate emergency supply production and distribution. And actually, one example that we see here in terms of business continuity plan is this lean business continuity vouchers established by the Irish government that is really to provide training and advisory services to companies, many SMEs, so that they actually have the knowledge of what to do in terms of crisis response, in terms of the necessary process reengineering when a crisis happens, and planning for resilience in general after the crisis. In terms of response, obviously this has to do with the actions taken immediately before or after the disaster ensues to save lives, reduce health impacts, and ensure public safety. Obviously, what happens when response in terms of supply, emergency sourcing, import facilitation, logistics support, in terms of operations, increasing production capacity, for example, through the repurposing to the pivoting of manufacturing operations. We have that ability to respond. And in terms of demand, for example, government procurement guarantees and the facilitation and logistics support. So an example of a measure in terms of response, this supply chain task force in the United States, the COVID-19 supply chain task force from the US Federal Agency, Emergency Management Agency. So it's the direct involvement of this government-led task force to fly in supplies into the US, reducing the time of shipping from weeks to days. So it's actually the task force that have the manufacturing know-how that is enough to understand how the supply chains are configured. And finally, recovery, the restoring or improving of livelihoods, aligning to these principles of building back better, in terms of supply, making sure that we don't have those vulnerabilities again. In terms of operations, building up domestic production capability, identify as critical to emergency. And in terms of demand, things like promoting market diversification in those areas where demand has collapsed, but also promotion of green growth, as Jennifer has mentioned. And an example, as the Jennifer has already mentioned, is South Korea's New Deal. And an important part of the Korean New Deal is that it's not just measures in terms of the supply, but also incentives so that the demand is pulling those energy efficient goods, including domestic goods, but also cars and sources of energy like hydrogen. So just the final message for this presentation is that COVID-19 has reminded us yet again of the need to more explicitly recognize the role of manufacturing, not just for this pandemic, but also for future disasters. Second is that building back better requires actions to address manufacturing, supply, operational, and demand risks across these kind of phases of emergency management outlined by the Sendai framework. And all of this requires strengthening the manufacturing evidence and know-how in policymaking, learning from international experience, and avoid history repeating itself again. So, well, that's the presentations now. So now I'm going to turn to a dialogue, a discussion. I would like to ask Jennifer and Claire to join me in the discussion. So thank you very much for joining us, Claire. Thank you for listening to our presentations. And I think really we wanted to talk to you. First of all, we've looked at how other countries are thinking about manufacturing recovery, growth, resilience. So what is your perspective on the main challenges ahead, and how is the UK government approaching these challenges?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Jennifer, for excellent presentations. I just wanted to start by, before I go on to the questions, if it's okay, Carlos, I mean, just to really thank colleagues from IFM. I mean, just so that everybody probably on the call is aware that certainly during the height of the pandemic last year, IFM colleagues worked really closely with us to understand exactly what other countries were doing, so that we could actually look at some of the best practice that was happening globally. And that was really, really helpful to inform policy, not just within my team, but actually broader across the department, and sharing that with Treasury colleagues too. So thank you very much for that. It is really great to get the insights that you're able to provide. I mean, in terms of challenges, I guess one of the slides that really strikes me is on your slides, Carlos, is the tidal wave one. And I think it's obviously worth remembering that, you know, even ahead of COVID, we were facing real significant challenges within the UK and globally through climate change and the issues that was already presenting to UK manufacturing. We've set the target for the goal and ambition for net zero by 2050. And with manufacturing accounting for such a significant share of CO2 emissions in the UK, about 17%, it's no mean feat to ensure that we can drive that down through manufacturing. So I think, that's kind of my starting reference point and the challenges we were already facing. So net zero, but also lower levels of productivity than ideal. I mean, you referenced 2008. Although manufacturing generally has twice the levels of productivity than the rest of the economy, we've had fairly stagnant productivity levels within UK manufacturing since 2008. So we were already trying to address challenges across manufacturing sectors before the pandemic hit. I mean, what did that expose to us? I mean, one, on the positive, it exposed that, UK manufacturers can really respond when needed. I mean, I've absolutely got to sort of recognise the way that manufacturers and engineers in the UK and institutions like High Value Manufacturing Catapult and Digital Catapult were able to rise to the challenge of things like the ventilator challenge, that we had SMEs and large companies providing the critical goods we needed in terms of PPE. And really the importance that technology was able to play in that. But it also exposed those real vulnerabilities we have in terms of our supply chains and the real interconnectedness. So globalization obviously brings real opportunities and benefits for our manufacturers and to tap into suppliers. There's also those challenges it presents in a scenario like COVID, whereby you can't then access with ease, the goods, materials, components that you actually need to ensure that production continues. Although you identified that obviously production and trading levels are broadly back to where they were, we can't ignore the fact that demand hit sectors, particularly in aerospace and automotive in the UK, continue to be challenged. And the really important part of that is that those sectors provide the lion's share of the research and development and innovation in the UK to diffuse across other sectors. So, those are some of the immediate challenges and observations. I mean, a few of the things I just want to highlight before, we discuss further is that if I sort of think back to even before the pandemic, the issues that have been consistently raised with me and that we've been trying to address through policy, not just within BEIS, but working with other departments, is the skills. I mean, I'd be surprised if I don't get a question on that today or we get into that. The skills one is a huge topic, as we know. In Maine, we get lots of questions about, well, actually, we don't have the technical skills, or we don't have the leadership and management skills. It is a very complex picture. It sounds like a bit of an easy get out, but we can't overlook the fact that manufacturing consistently over 20 years has had some of the highest levels of vacancies within the UK. And actually, 48% of manufacturers consistently say it's due to skills shortages that those vacancies persist. So it is a huge issue. Also getting more of our companies to actually invest in innovation, and even before getting into an innovation scenario, of actually being able to take up existing technology or invest in new equipment. So those are some of the the real challenges. And as I said at the start, overlaying that with the need now to transition into net zero, it was a challenging landscape ahead of the pandemic.
Great, thank you, Claire. I mean, you were talking a little bit about obviously the topic of innovation being quite important. We've received some questions here, but just wondering if you could perhaps share a little bit more about the latest thinking. I mean, we talk a lot about the role of manufacturing in achieving these targets. We talk about the principles of building back better and understanding the manufacturing contribution to net zero. Just wondering if you could give us a little bit more details about where government thinking is right now in terms of innovation strategies, and also a little bit about the initiatives like Made Smarter that are obviously looking at the innovation angle of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess, one of the things as well, my envy when I hear about other countries' approaches, and of course you pick from the best, don't you? The best of the best, and flag the sort of programs that fill me with green with envy. But the one about growing manufacturing share, I mean, that's not something we're at the moment. I mean, I think it's a sort of thing of to be tested with ministers. It's an ongoing discussion that we have, certainly within BEIS and with other departments about, our ambitions for potentially growing the manufacturing sector, given that the pandemic has shown that actually having a healthy manufacturing sector is vital to the resilience of the broader economy. We're not there yet. I mean, we've obviously had the plan for growth, Build Back Better, that set out the broad framework of priorities. So unleashing innovation, skills, infrastructure, and of course, moving towards net zero. And then before that, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I mean, I guess you've got to look at those through the lens in the context of manufacturing. Those are broad things that provide a framework for healthy manufacturing sectors, but also ought to be signalling to manufacturers the opportunities. I mean, the big game in town, right, is going to be net zero, is clean growth. So manufacturers to be able to change processes where need be, but also to be able to provide us with the green products, you know, be it electric vehicles, but also looking at some of the green technologies that we want to be able to export globally to help reduce emissions. So the big net zero piece, there's also a net zero strategy that's in development at the moment that will be published later in the year. The next strategy that obviously manufacturers, everyone's interested in, is the innovation strategy that is due to be published towards the end of June. Things I can tell you about the innovation strategy at the moment. I mean, if you don't know, the chair of the Innovation Advisory Group, Hayat Salem, from the Royal Academy of Engineering, she and a range of stakeholders have been advising government on this. The innovation strategy does have a really strong focus on adoption. So I think it's going to be called ADAPT. I think it's obviously work in progress at the moment and all for ministerial agreement. But I think that's a really big step forward, the recognition that actually adopting existing technologies and what's already out there is really important, and that we can move forward without maybe even getting to the stage of, you know, companies themselves undertaking R&D and innovation, although ideally that is where we want more companies to be moving within the UK. So there's also, if you look at the plan for growth, Build Back Better, at the end of that document, there is a series of other strategies that are being announced. So we don't know whether or not there's going to be a manufacturing strategy. I'd love to get people's views on you know, the value of a manufacturing strategy, but we do know that there is appetite for subsectoral strategies, probably to reflect, you know, the real challenges and the opportunities from the pandemic, including for medicines manufacture, electric vehicles. So yeah, quite a raft of strategies. You mentioned Made Smarter. Thanks for that, Carlos. My team leads on Made Smarter. You know, I think we can't look at the impact of the pandemic and businesses' response to it through the lens of digitalisation. We know through the feedback we were getting from businesses that those businesses that had a degree of digitalisation and innovation within the business felt that they were more resilient and better able to cope with the pandemic, be that to pivot to new opportunities or go to remote monitoring and operational management. So I think, you know, that has to be a strong focus, and that is what we are focused on. So if you're not aware, we have a £147 million innovation programme that's run through colleagues in UKRI. Chris Courtney is the challenge director for that, and that's about developing a new digital solutions or industrial digital technology solutions that we want more of our companies to adopt. And then there's our programme for adoption, which has been running in the Northwest successfully for a couple of years. We're just starting to roll that out to West Midlands, to Yorkshire and Humber, and to the Northeast. So not full scale up across England, but yeah, and I say it's England because that type of support is a devolved matter. So Scotland has their own programme, Wales and Northern Ireland considering. So, you know, that has been, you know, those are some of the planks of the government's response, if you like. And there's lots happening on the skills side. There's a post-16 an adult skills bill that's just gone through that sort of sets out commitments to lifelong learning, tech education. So that there is an awful lot happening in this space. Doesn't hang together in a lovely, neat manufacturing strategy, but, you know, there is an awful lot out there for manufacturers to access.
Thank you, Claire. That's very interesting. Thank you for those updates. I think one of the points that you perhaps started to allude there is the difference in the impacts that the crisis has had in different sectors and different types of companies, and obviously different regions as well. I think that's a topic that also was raised by Jennifer, the issues around the differences in the responses for the most affected areas or the most affected industries. I'm just wondering, we have a couple of questions, I think, related to that. So what are the most important things that need to be addressed in the UK's regional industrial strategies? But also just wondering, I know you're interested in issues of diversity in manufacturing. So just wonder, how do you see this playing out after the crisis? Is it going to be more important in the agenda, issue of diversity in manufacturing, or what else can be done to address these disparities there?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Carlos. Well, I mean, the other set piece that I didn't mention that I should have, because obviously it's so much in the press at the moment, is the levelling up, potentially white paper, later on in the year. And BEIS and other departments are working on that with number 10 at the moment for what that means. Of course, anybody involved in manufacturing knows the importance of manufacturing to regions outside of London and the southeast. So we're doing everything we can to, that is already recognised. It's not, I'm not having to push that message, but actually, really, what does it mean to translate? What's the sort of support that's on offer? What are the types of industries? What's the importance of clustering of businesses coming together in those regions to support local economies and access to high value jobs and high level skills? So that is absolutely important. I mean, again, from COVID, what we know is that, it was regions, and particularly say Northwest, Northeast, which are saying that they were most impacted by their ability to invest. And so going forward, how are we going to get businesses in all regions to have the ability to invest in the new technology or new equipment? So we know there are disparities, and there were disparities before the pandemic. So we're absolutely looking at that going forward. On the diversity side, yes, it is absolutely passion of mine. The one that I just did a stakeholder engagement exercise a few months ago, and we were looking at some of the real entrenched inequalities within sectors in terms of underrepresentation. Certainly gender is the most obvious one, with 24% of female representation only within UK manufacturing. We've got to be able to do better. And the reason I think that really matters is that the point I made earlier about the enduring vacancies that we have within manufacturing sectors and within engineering, they're not going to be filled by more men, right? We need more women to come in to fill these vacancies and to address the challenges that manufacturers are facing. The evidence is there. I mean, it's not just as in, we know that companies that have more diversity have better turnover, better profit, they're more innovative. So why wouldn't businesses take it on? I mean, that's easier said than done. I recognise that, and we want to understand more insights into the barriers that are stopping more women in particular getting into manufacturing. But I absolutely think that is a way that we can make manufacturing even better than it is.
Thank you so much, Clare. That's great, and it's interesting that as you were talking about skills, and that you're surely going to get a question on skills, there's a question here, and I think it's very much related to conversations around the image of manufacturing, in the public image of manufacturing. So the question here is about how can we make manufacturing more attractive to skilled graduates on a politically strategic level? What kind of, it says the IMEC-E, for example, has released multiple papers and what it calls a crisis of graduate turnover rates, especially highlighting a gender disparity. I mean, obviously you talk gender disparity, but there is the issue of more STEM skills, but also how do you translate those into more skills in the manufacturing sector? So yes, I think I'll put that question to you in terms of what can be done on a politically strategic level.
I think that's a really tough one, because I know my colleagues within DFE will point to all the really great work that's done to raise, interest and awareness of STEM and the importance of getting more girls in particular interested in STEM, and then to take up engineering. But as you point out, that doesn't really translate into actual people, those girls, women going into manufacturing and engineering jobs. I mean, over the last 20 years, there's only been a 2% increase in female representation in manufacturing, despite all the pushes for increase in STEM and the interest. I mean, obviously, I don't have the answers to this, right? I mean, there is this view when doing lots of engagement with stakeholders over the last few months, and we're asking, what will attract? Is it going to be, digitalization and a greater image in terms of technology? Is it going to be addressing climate change? I think these are to be tested, right? If they're going to attract more females in. I mean, you and I were discussing some time ago about the fact that, you know, what's the entry barriers for females into manufacturing? Do you have to have an engineering degree, or do you have to have a technical background? Well, no, there are more jobs than just that. But actually, there is difference between smaller firms. I mean, if you're going to access a large company where you can get in, I don't know, I hate to use the HR when it's not that, but I mean, if I give an example, speaking to Kelly Becker from Schneider Electric, who's the new VP, she's not an engineer by background, but she's come through the organization to be a powerful woman in manufacturing and engineering. Do we need to look at getting just more people in from different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, as well as sort of focusing on, this is all about, you've got to have an engineering or technical background. So yeah, will campaigns work? Apparently not. You know, I mean, there is research out there as well. DFE don't think that raising awareness and campaigns has a clear enough evidence base to do that. So I think, you know, just making sure that people are aware of the opportunities across the breadth of manufacturing and engineering does help, be it through careers guidance, but maybe things like digitalisation and net zero will also help us. Good to get views on that.
Yeah, I think actually, Jennifer, you've been looking at this issue of digitalization and how digitalization could be, I mean, there could be this also barrier or perhaps lack of inclusivity in digitalization as companies become more connected. I wonder whether you have any views on generally in the topic of inclusivity, what kind of measures can be have been put in place to address or to improve inclusivity in industry or in society in general, but also whether you have come across anything as well on gender.
Yeah,
Sorry to put you on the spot, Jennifer.
No, it's fine. No, and it's very interesting to me that what you're mentioning, Claire, about inclusivity. And I was just wondering, because obviously there have been like more and more voices talking about the need of a care reform in the UK. And if this is something that from an industrial strategy or from a manufacturing perspective is something that the government is looking at, because obviously it's a lot of research and evidence on how care is still gendered in general in the world, but also in the UK, and how a better care sector, both for children and the elderly, will allow more women to participate in the UK market.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't be sort of, you know, I'd be being I wouldn't be being honest if I said yes, this was all joined up and there was a plan to look at that. But, you know, as part of trying to understand why we're not getting more, you know, women and girls interested in manufacturing, we're looking at the barriers and obstacles. So if that is actually coming up as a strong barrier, you know, I think it's often raised as one of the reasons. I mean, you know, we talked to DWP colleagues about this, and they'll say, what about childcare? Is that a barrier, for example? It doesn't come out as the main strongest barrier, although I think, yes. Yeah, and then again, could digitalization and technology and the fact that we've proven throughout the pandemic that depending on the job, there's opportunities to be more flexible, right, in the ways that we work. Is that going to overcome some of those obstacles? I mean, you know, possibly, potentially. I mean, government is interested in it, and ministers are interested in the whole agenda. I mean, we as a sort of public body have to publish equalities goals, targets, if you like. So this is something that I've been working on with stakeholders over the last few months. We're hoping that something is going to be published fairly soon to set that out, particularly recognising this issue in terms of manufacturing. So, you know, if that's going to also help raise the profile, I think that's a positive thing. But I think one of the things that we're encountering, and I don't underestimate this, and there's colleagues I know on the call, including Nina from Make UK, we've been talking about this. You know, there is an issue. You've got to recognise that people find this uncomfortable to talk about. diversity and inclusion, I mean, then we use them interchangeably, but then they're not really the same. And actually, all the evidence there shows that you've got to have an inclusive organisation, be opening, welcoming, to your employees, but you've also got to have greater diversity and representation, but to get to maximise positive outcomes. But people don't like talking about diversity. That's my experience within BEIS. It does make people feel very uncomfortable and clam up, and lots of tumbleweed moments when you talk about it. But we need to recognise that it leads to better results, and the more that businesses recognise that too, the better, really.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I think I'm just there's just 3 points I'm going to raise. Obviously, we just have 5 minutes left, but just wanted to raise 3 points, including questions that we've received. First one is around the response of manufacturing during the crisis. Obviously, at the height of the crisis, we were all hoping or relying on this manufacturing capability to have more respirators, to have more medical inputs, obviously, to keep the supply chains running in the food industry. So the question is, how clear do you think are those lessons of the role that manufacturing were played? Were they well captured by the policy discourse that is emerging? It's not only about the manufacturing industry, but also about all those institutions supporting industry. Obviously, the role that the catapults, the high-value manufacturing catapults had during the ventilator challenge, the role of innovation support, like ISCF, Made Smarter that you mentioned. I mean, how well learned was that lesson? That's the first one, perhaps. Second one is around, it's probably not really related, but it's about the role of international organizations. What can they do to help government agendas and government thinking and evidence as we try to build back better? And I think that, the last question is really probably a selfish question, which is, what are the areas that require further research that outfits like the Institute for Manufacturing can actually help provide that evidence that is required? So 3 different points, and please pick and choose.
Can I hold those 3 in my head? Let's test. Wow. Go for the first one. I mean, that's a tough one, right? I mean, I'd like to sort of think, yes. I mean, institutes like the Catapult, they're already excellent, and I know that they've learned lessons from this, and obviously they're going to bank that knowledge and capability, and then hopefully we can use that, for not just managing future shocks or challenges, but actually in everyday opportunities, right, for businesses, be that how they collaborate with large and small companies, how they use technology. So I think those lessons, absolutely. Am I entirely confident that, say, things like, better coordination and collaboration across manufacturers to, say, repurpose, pivot to PPE production is going to continue, and there's going to be a plan for that? I don't know yet. I mean, the thing that I think it really also exposed, which I think we've all known for years, because other things I get asked in this event is like, surely there's more we could be doing through public procurement to, increase opportunities for manufacturers. One of the first meetings I attended in this job 7 years ago was about public procurement, and that was the top of the list of a bunch of trade bodies saying, well, we've got to do more, and we've not nailed that yet. There is no doubt that having a clear line of sight to an opportunity and a commission, if you like, as in, could you produce ventilators at pace, and industry rose to the challenge. That is something that will drive behaviours and in this case, a really positive response. Are we going to use that through procurement going forward? I don't know. I really don't know. But I think that is not going away. We've just had the procurement consultation and green paper, so there's going to be a response to that shortly. So I know it's just a sort of half answer, but I think it will be to be tested about how we then take forward those lessons. And the role of international organisations, I mean, I think there is a great role. I think there is about, there's obviously a convening opportunity for different organisations to bring international players together. I think what we tend to do in the UK is to get more engaged when there are more specific focused discussions. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I think sometimes broader manufacturing discussions about the importance of manufacturing more broadly are quite difficult for, I mean, me and my team are always up for those, but do, you know, the broader Whitehall or government see the value? I'm not sure. I think it's when it's very targeted on a particular challenge or mission. If that's about energy, if it's about particular technology, I think that's the sort of thing that gets people to say, yeah, that's a priority to come together. In terms of you know, more research, I mean, you and I for a long time have been discussing about understanding supply chains, what makes supply chains resilient. I think really understanding some of the drivers for why businesses themselves change or pivot or actually overcome problems themselves would be really helpful. So something on some looking at some deep use cases about, you know, what were the business drivers that made maybe a supply chain company change, or how they're succeeding, or how they're sort of viewing the future. And I do think the skills one is really important to look at, the diversity issue. I don't know if that's an issue that you guys have got involved in before, but I think it is something that's you know, an area to explore and to define. I think that the third thing I would sort of say is that, you know, it does feel like there's a real synergies between the whole digitalisation agenda and net zero, but I think that does need to be explored further. I mean, we've had the decarbonisation strategy. We were able to sort of you know, work with those guys to identify Made Smarter as an opportunity within that, and that digitalisation going forward. But, you know, I think we've got to recognise that, you know, we had some work with research with Accenture a couple of years ago now on net zero, where they identified that, you know, to be able to meet net zero, we've got to move 3 times faster than we're currently doing in terms of the change. That's not going to happen unless we're using technology. So I think understanding more about the interdependencies between digitalisation and net zero is going to be really important going forward too. I think those were the 3 things you asked, Carla.
Covered them excellently. That's great, Jared. You did remember perfectly. We're just coming to a close. We have shared a link in the chat for your feedback. Please, if you have a minute just to give us a feedback about this event, the link is there. So yeah, I mean, I think it has been very interesting conversation, Claire. I mean, we've talked about, I guess, the lessons learned, how the future agenda. We talk about skills. We talk about diversity and gender. We talk about the public discourse around manufacturing, and of course, things like digitalization and decarbonization. So thanks so much. It's been really good to talk to you. We look forward to reading the outcome, of course, of the strategies that are being developed. As you said, that they will be published over the summer. Yeah, I'd like to just give you the last word.
Just to say thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I mean, this sort of format of discussion, I think, is really great. So I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, no, thanks for your continued support and work. Thank you so much,
Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Claire.
See you around. See you next time. Bye-bye.